go. Hello and welcome to APUS History with Mr. David Benson. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get our screen up and running. And you can see me in the corner. Hi, everybody. How you doing? And let's get our show on the road. Ladies and gentlemen, it's George Washington and the New Nation. Yay! You'll see a website at the top of your notes. Please go there to get some free extra multiple choice questions throughout the year. This guy posts a new one every day, and he's got the past years. Great review. I highly recommend it. George Washington and the New Nation. The Constitution is launched 1789, and we're on the road, ladies and gentlemen. We're off and running, and what is America like at this time? Well, we got a couple of key points, and my numbers are a little off from what yours might look like, but that's okay. Number one, rapid, mad population growth, 25-year doubling time. It's incredible. Cities are growing, but keep in mind, it's still 90% rural. Most of the country is, in fact, rural. Fear of central power. This has been a decade of government smashing. We overthrew a king. We overthrew the Articles of Confederation. We've now got this new government. It's incredible. It's wild, and who knows if it's going to last, right? And then finally, number three up here, 5% of America lives west of the Appalachians. 95. Most of America lives right there on the coast in the old America that's been part of the colonies and is now free and independent. And that brings us to Big George, good old G-dubs. It is George, elected president, 1789. Here's a story.
Hello! I'm George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. I'm someone you should get to know. I was born here in Westmoreland County, Virginia in 1732. I died here in Mount Vernon, Virginia in 1799. So I lived...
All right, that's enough of the silly Georgeness. Let's move on. I like those cartoons, though. George is elected, as you can see from this map, by unanimous electoral vote. He got every single elector voted for him. But then you're saying, wait a minute, why does John Adams have 34 and John Jay 9? Well, guys, everybody got 2 votes back in those days. And the guy with the most votes is president, and the second most votes is vice president. George is the only president ever unanimously elected. There's another one later who got all votes but 1, and that guy said, I'm not going to vote for George because I want George to be, or for this guy, I'm not going to tell you who it is, because I want George to be the only one who ever got to say that was true. If you look at the close-up of how the states went, you kind of see here and notice that North Carolina and New York didn't vote, so there were 2 states not voting. There's a story behind that for another day. When George runs again, with everybody voting, he'll still get 100% of the Electoral College votes. Now, that time, it was a lot closer, the second vote, because Adams will get 77, Clinton will get 50. It's quite close. Not Bill Clinton, of course, but George. Not quite ready for the Bill of Rights yet, so let's go back to this. The first capital was in New York City, and George will preside over our first government. And one of the first things he'll do, and this is the cool thing about George as a president, anything he does, whether it's in the Constitution or not, becomes a precedent. Everybody loves the guy, and so when he does it, that means that presidents will do it in the future. And the first thing he does, or one of the first, is creates a cabinet. And the original cabinet had 3 officers. Secretary of State, that's Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasurer, that's Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of the Treasury, Hammy, as I like to call him. And Secretary of War, Henry Knox, as in Fort Knox, where all the gold is. And now we're ready to talk about the second big event, which is the Bill of Rights. This was a deal they made. We'll only pass the Constitution if you guys create a Bill of Rights. So James Madison and his guys got together, and right away they put together the Bill of Rights. And it passes very, very quickly. And these are important. You've got 1 through 8 there on the side of the screen, quickly described for you. Article 9, of course, is that you can't list all the rights, so it doesn't mean that it's not a right if it's not on here. And Article 10 is that anything not mentioned is reserved to the states or to the people. But we don't always do it quite that way, do we now? All right. They also passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. I love these billboards. What does it do? It sets up the way the judicial branch will work. This is a very short article, Article 3 of the Constitution. There's not much in there. It organizes the courts. It organizes the Supreme Court. This was a power they were given by the Constitution, Congress that is. And it sets it up with 6 justices, 5 justices and 1 chief justice. And it's going to grow a little bit later. But right now, we're talking about 6. And that brings me to one of my all-time favorite topics, Hammy and his bank. Someday I plan to write a children's book about U.S. history, and I'm going to call it Hammy and his bank. Alexander Hamilton was one of the key figures in the U.S. government, and he tried to stick his nose into everybody's business. He was George Washington's right-hand man during the war, his personal secretary. It became Hammy's goal, in fact, to shape not only the financial policies of government, but to influence the president on every matter that he could, pretty much. Hammy believed that if we favored the wealthy groups in America, that they would give money to the government, and they would loan money, that is, and as they got richer, their prosperity would bring America up, and also their wealth would trickle down to everybody else. So Hammy had a couple of key points. Number one, he said we got to repay all the debts, right? And this is called the assumption of debt. He wanted the federal government to assume all the states' debts because they're in debt because they helped create this government, right? Sort of. And that's number two, which we call the assumption of state debts. Not only are we going to pay all of our debts and be good for our money, but we're going to assume all the state's debts. But there's a problem here, and it's a fundamental problem. Massachusetts loves this. They've got lots of debt. They spent a lot on the war. Virginia hates it, right? They cry foul because they've paid off their debt. They don't owe anymore, so why are their taxes now going to go to help pay off Massachusetts' debt? A compromise is brought about, all right? And this is incredible. But basically, part of the compromise is moving of the national capital. And they move it to the south. It moves to Washington, D.C., right next to Virginia. There's a lot of benefits of having the capital right next door. Of course, right? Also, number three in your notes, the national debt rises. He begins our tradition of a national debt. At that point, it's laughable compared to now, $75 million. But not everybody thought it was cool to have a national debt. This was kind of an issue. And I want to just point out right here that you've got Hamilton on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right. These were the two guys that George Washington would submit anything to. He'd say, hey, guys, what do you think? And they disagreed on everything. And which way do you think George tended to go? If you said Hamilton, you were right. He almost always picked Hammy over Jefferson. And some of their letters are amazing. They almost sound like children trying to get the love and attention of their wayward father. You know, come on, listen to me. Don't listen to that crazy guy. Goes on and on. They're fun to read. Anyways, Hamilton convinces the new government to issue new taxes, tariffs in this case, right? Not ready for the bus yet. They issue these tariffs, 8% tariffs on imports, all right? Revenue and protection of industry is the idea here, because remember, England is dumping all these goods, so we're going to protect industry with tariffs. Tariff is a tax on foreign goods. But he also convinces them to do an excise tax. And I put that full definition in your notes. I'll read it real quick. Excise tax are considered an indirect form of taxation because the government does not directly apply the tax. An intermediary, either the producer or merchant, is charged and then must pay the tax to the government. Kind of like the Townshend Acts. You remember those? That worked, right? No. This was crazy, right? We just fought a war about taxes. And this one was on whiskey. They put a 7-cent per gallon tax on whiskey. And this, my friends, was frankly crazy. And people went really crazy about it, but we'll get there in a second. Let's talk about the Bank of the United States of America. This was Hammy's baby. He said we need to copy the English because the English are the greatest in the world. We'll be that someday, but we're not yet. And we have to build a bank, and it's going to be called the Bank of the United States. It's going to be like a federal depository of all of our monies, but it's a private bank, all right? And Thomas Jefferson came running in, and he cried foul. He said, no way, this isn't constitutional. There's no right in the Constitution to do this. This doesn't exist. And Hamilton says, no, we can do it. It is in there. Well, it's not in there, Hamilton admits, right? But it doesn't say we can't do it. Try that one when your parents, you get in trouble for something one of these days. You didn't ever tell me I couldn't do that, X, Y, or Z, right? And this is the start of the big debate, loose versus strict construction. The strict constructionists, at this point, TJ and his followers, Jefferson, said that if it's not in the Constitution, you're not supposed to do it unless you create an amendment. The loose constructionists, the loosey-goosey team, right? These are the ones who said that the elastic clause is their favorite, which says anything necessary and proper can be done by Congress. Well, who defines necessary and proper? Well, these guys, they want to be the ones who define it, of course. Anyways, he convinces George, and they do create the bank. The bank is incredibly popular in the North, not so popular in the South, gets a 20-year charter, and we're off. Remember those taxes? Let's go back to those taxes, right? There's these new taxes. People are not happy, and the result is going to be the Whiskey Rebellion. And you want to compare this puppy to Shays' Rebellion because there's a lot of important similarities. People are outraged. Whiskey is not just a drink, my friends. Whiskey is like currency out on the frontier. Wheat goes bad, whiskey doesn't. So you convert it to whiskey, and then you can sell it. People felt like they were being taxed without being represented. This was a federal government tax. People put up whiskey poles in honor of the old Liberty poles. And there was this huge uprising. And because we have this new strong central government, they wanted to show who's boss. And so in one swift maneuver, Hamilton pretty much begs George to do it. George sends in 13,000 soldiers. And who's that marching in front of the soldiers? That's right, George Washington, right behind him, Alexander Hamilton. It's the only time that the U.S. President and the Secretary of the Treasury have led for our troops into something of a battle. Against our own people, I might add. Basically, there was one shot fired, 3 people were killed, and the entire thing dispersed. It was once described as using a sledgehammer to crush a gnat. But people use it as evidence of how strong and powerful this new government is. Others might use it as criticism to say, look, people have the right to rebel against attacks. Isn't that what our whole founding was about? And then you're going to crush them with 13,000 soldiers before we even hear their grievances? Seems a little crazy. This brings us to the emergence of political parties. And so I got to go back a slide there. Not in the Constitution. You got to remember that. George Washington hated it. He was against it. But we're starting to see a bunch of different issues. And I want you to look at these different issues and think about how they relate to the political party system. Okay. So here we've got the Proclamation of Neutrality and Citizen Genet, 2 important topics. Number 1, the French Revolution and foreign policy. And George Washington, mostly we're talking now his second term. France invades Austria. And we've also got the Reign of Terror going on in France and throughout Europe. And yet we have this group of people under Thomas Jefferson who still really respect what the French Revolution stands for, and they want to side with the French, actually. On the other hand, George and Hammy and his guys are all like, no, we want to stay out of this, steer clear. And so George passes the Neutrality Proclamation that we won't get involved. We managed to make England and France both pretty mad. Citizen Genet, known as the Genet Incident. This guy was the French ambassador, and he was on American soil trying to rally support for the French cause on our own soil. And he made the government quite angry, and he ends up getting kicked out of the country because he was seen as going over the head of our own government. We declared ourselves neutral. You can't start rallying forces for your battle. But of course, he was reminding them that we helped you get your freedom in the first place, and you owe us this favor. He was in New York doing this, and he was very popular in New York. Well, we move on. We've got some serious tensions with the United Kingdom, with England, Great Britain, whatever you want to call it. They didn't close their frontier posts. They were arming the Indians against us, right? And then very dramatically in 1791, Little Turtle, no, that's the wrong Little Turtle, sorry. Little Turtle, the Native American warrior, hands the U.S. Army one of their worst defeats against Indians ever. The Indians are all sort of rallying together in the old Ohio Territory, and they realize this is their last chance. After the Pontiac Rebellion, they came back again. It's incredible. But 1794, the famous Battle of Fallen Timbers, the U.S. will crush these Indians, including the Miami Indians was one of the main tribes in the area. And the British allies abandon them, fleeing wholesale. They want to get way out of there as fast as they can. And it leads to the signing of the Treaty of Grenville, where the Indians are pushed further west yet again. That was signed in 1795, and that pretty much opens up Ohio for the easy settlement that will come next. At the same time, the English were seizing American ships. They took 300 of our ships, and they would force our guys in the Navy and take our goods, and there was all kinds of tensions, and so we signed a thing called Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty was essentially the same treaty that we already had. There was hardly any change. The English again pledged to give back their forts, but again didn't do it, and so it was really seen as kind of a weakness. Like, you just renegotiated the exact same thing, and nothing changed. Not so effective. Thomas Jefferson is so mad that he resigns his position of Secretary of State and heads home to Monticello. And that's when we come up with George Washington's farewell address, the most famous speech that was never spoken. Nowadays, farewell addresses are spoken, but instead of speaking his, he wrote it, and then it was read to Congress. And he made some very important points in this speech. He made an appeal for the unity of the states. He talked about how dangerous sectionalism is, and it's really prescient thinking about where we're going to go with the sectionalism rising and our road to the Civil War later. He begs and insists upon support for the new Constitution. Even though he was part of overthrowing the last Constitution, this one we should keep. He says, if we're going to change it, don't overthrow it. Use the amendment process. And they were really proud of that amendment process, and that was good. He warns of the dangers of political parties. He says these are not supposed to be part of the system. They might work for monarchies, but they don't work here in the Republic. It's kind of ironic. He says taxation is always going to cause trouble and conflict, but sometimes you just got to do it, so choose carefully. And then the most famous is his foreign affairs, what he says about the world. And it's often been misinterpreted as being a call to isolationism, but it was not, I don't believe, and many historians would agree with me. What he said was, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. It's that phrase, permanent alliances. He's saying no permanent alliance. He's not saying don't make an alliance as we need to here and there, but permanent alliances are when you really give everything you got to say that we're going to support France or England or whoever in whatever conflict that they find themselves in. No, he says, we're too small. If we pick the wrong side, we could cease to exist. We need to stay on our own side and pick what makes sense at the time. We will follow this policy more or less all the way until World War II, the end of World War II, and the formation of NATO in the late 1940s. But we'll talk about that later. We come now to the next election. Dun, da, da, da. 1796, John Adams gets, and we now have two parties, right? And I'll talk about that in a second, but we've got a Federalist Party and a Democratic Republican Party. John Adams gets 71, Jefferson gets 68. It's unbelievably close. But the really crazy thing is, of course, that the guy with the first votes is president, and the second most votes is vice president. So we've got two opposing parties, president and vice president. It'd be like if president was Obama and the vice president was Romney, because that was first and second place, right? We're going to fix this problem later, because it was crazy. And notice how sectionalized the vote is and how little we've changed today. Now, the regions may shift a little bit, but it's all one region voting for one party and almost all of another region voting for another party. Adams. He was stubborn. He was unpopular. He was self-important, ungracious. They called him his rotundity. But he was one of the founding fathers, clearly, one of the key voices for independence and freedom and kind of a hero and all that. And so it was like it was his due or something. Also, Alexander Hamilton would have been on his side, the Federalist, but he was way too unpopular and too scandalous. I believe he had a lover who was married to somebody else at the time. All kinds of things were going on. Where was I? There's a quasi-war going on with France at the time. Ooh, there we go. We just finished our slides. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop the presentation right there because somehow I didn't save the final slides. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you soon.